sometimes this happens. While we're on the topic of gaming, I guess, let's talk about some FF16 stuff. I was about to say 14. 16. So, if you guys don't know about this, there was this joke a while back when FF14 Endwalker came out. FF14 Grapes. So, in a place called... Was it Sharlayan? Was it Sharlayan that had the grapes? Yeah, it was Labyrinthos. So, yeah, in Sharlayan. So, in Labyrinthos, there were these grapes. They looked like this. This is how they looked in a modern video game that had an expansion come out that year. And everybody loved the grapes, right? Like, everybody memed on the grapes, but at the end of the day, people thought the grapes looked good. And in, like, a jokey sense. Eventually, they replaced the grapes with... Actually, here's a much better picture of the grapes. It just looks like a crystal, right? Eventually, they included a new model for the grapes, which wasn't much better. Like, it really wasn't any better. In fact, you could argue it's probably worse. For this time, they added some more polygons to it. I would say this looks worse, if you ask me. Like, it's not good. It's not good by any means. I think, arguably, the meme grapes look better. But because of this, and because YoshiP is the director, or the producer on FF16, someone asked him about the grapes in FF16. So, let's see what he actually had to say. Where do we go? So we definitely heard the feedback when we released that first trailer. People saw the UI and then gave a lot of feedback about how it looked so much like a fighting game. Okay, this is different stuff. Where is it? Where is the grape comment? So, someone asked, will Final Fantasy XVI have grapes? The response explained that there will be a region in the game that makes a lot of wine. So there'll be vineyards. And then comes the immortal quote. The first thing we did is we went in and checked the grape quality in Final Fantasy XVI. I made sure it was perfect. Art director Hiroshi Minagawa went on to add, translated by colleague Michael Christopher, Koji Fox, I looked at it and said, yeah, this is not going to be good enough. We need to raise the polygons in those grapes. Minagawa-san then adds, in English, next-gen grapes. Next-gen grapes, boys. Get excited for the next-gen grapes. I love that Yoshi is never going to be able to escape the grape comment. Like, he's never going to be able to escape grapes. Grapes are just an immortal thing in FF16 at this point. In FF14. In any game that he touches, right? Any game that he touches into the future, if there are grapes, people are going to ask about the quality of the grapes. I think he took the grape thing a little bit seriously. Maybe some people were actually angry about the quality of the grapes. Most people were just joking about it. They were like, this is just hilariously low quality, but like no one actually cared the grapes looked bad. In fact, people kind of want the grapes back. I'm certainly one of those people. Sadly, I wasn't an Endwalker at the time, so I didn't get to see the grapes firsthand. And now that I am in Sharlayan, and I've gone to Labyrinthos, I've seen the grapes, and sadly the grapes are, well, the modern grapes. But YoshiP's had a lot of interesting comments about 16. The one that I particularly wanted to talk about is his comments about open world games. So, if you haven't played 15, FF15 was the first truly open world Final Fantasy game. You would start the game in this one zone, the gates were locked, and that was sort of like the tutorial area. It was a massive zone by itself, and that could have been That could have been a big zone in just a regular game. But once you're done with like that first chapter, first, maybe second, then you got to go to basically the entire world. And you could just drive along wherever you wanted. Now, the problem with 15 is the open world. 15 had a lot of development issues. It had a lot of delays. The game got deleted a couple of times and remade from the ground up. And in this process, you had a game that had this massive world, but it didn't need a massive world. It was this massive world that felt empty. It felt like there was no reason for it to be there. Like, if you made it half the size, it would be the same game. It would just be quicker to get through. So YoshiP has like heard those comments, and they heard comments about 13 as well. Like 13 was the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, where it was basically you were basically in a corridor. Like 15, you could go anywhere you wanted. 13, you could go forward, and you could go backwards. Sometimes the backwards path was blocked off. Maybe there would be a diverging path that came back to the same thing. Maybe there'd be a chest there. Maybe. Possibly. But most of the time, it was just a corridor. And 13 did a really good job at keeping up the game's pace. A lot of people complained about the linearity of the game, the fact that it didn't have extra mini-games in like the same way that older games did, and that's a fair complaint. But it definitely kept up the pace of the story. Like, you're always going through story beats, and I felt like 13 was a really fun game. Up until you get to the open world, where the game falls apart. 15 was in the same way, where you just had that first area, really fun game. Then the entire world opens up, and it's like, well, I guess I could spend 5 minutes going over to this area and do a side quest there? I guess? So, 16 is taking a more zoned approach, where you have big open zones, but they're going to be very populated zones, and you're going to go between zones. There's no reason to, like, waste time traveling places that you don't need to travel in. And he had some interesting comments about the way you build an open world game. So Yoshida talked in the interview about the problems in FF15 that arose from having a massive open world that ultimately wound up feeling a little empty for some players. If probably most players, maybe some people like the open world, maybe they thought it was like cinematic or whatever term you want to use. For me, I just didn't like it as much. He also says that simply making a less vast open world just isn't possible for a game in this series. Naoki notes, if you create this open world of the 23 wards of Tokyo, then basically the story has to take place in the 23 wards of Tokyo, and it can't take place outside of that. You can create more areas outside of that, but then that takes a lot of resources, and the more that you create, then the bigger the chance that you have of that a giant area that you created becoming empty. And that's the one thing that players hate the most, a huge open world, but there's nothing to do in it. So what he's saying is, if you make a big open world, then you basically are forcing yourself to use it for the content. Like, you're going to have big boss fights in this open world. You're going to have all of these events in the open world. And you could just not do it. And then have, like, separate zones where the big story beats happen. But the problem is, now you have this big open world where there's just empty space for no reason. You can do that, but, like, as he says, a lot of people don't like this sort of world. Like, back when Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, things like that were happening, the idea of having a big open world was really exciting. Like, Far Cry 3, when that came out, that was a super exciting game. The problem is, when you've played enough open world games, it's just like, why is it open? Like, the whole appeal of a world being open sort of starts to disappear. I think the best example of an open world is you have a big map, but not. I think the best example of an open world is probably like some of the earlier Grand Theft Auto games. Like, they are technically open world games. Like, you have a big map, you can go anywhere you want. but the maps are small enough where they feel very populated. Or Yakuza is even a better example of this. Like Yakuza 0 has a technically an open world, but it's this one town and it's very packed. It's populated to the fucking brim. Like when you're first going through Yakuza 0, you will run into side content like every fucking minute. That is when an open world is done right. Or San Andreas. Like San Andreas is another great example where you have this big open world map, but there's always things that are going on. And that's something that's being lost on a lot of games that are making the selling point of the game being a big map. Like you'll see big MMOs that are coming out, like Ashes of Creation. They're like, we have an X number of kilometer squared map, and that's cool, and it sounds really neat. But when you realize that just means there's going to be like tens of thousands of square meters of the map that are just nothing, it's just running for the sake of running, it just loses its appeal. I hope that whatever is done with 16's world, because I've not played it yet. By the time this comes out, I might have played it. I don't know when this is coming out. I hope whatever is done with the map keeps up those story beats, or at least drives you towards where the game wants you to go. Because 13 fell apart for me, and I have not even finished 13 because it just got really boring. 13 fell apart for me when you got that big that big open map, and it's just like, here's a side quest, okay, go over here. Here's a side quest, go over here. Here's a side quest, go over here. And it's just directing you around the map, and then by the time you get to the main quest, it's like, okay, now I've got to run 10 minutes back to the other side of the map. Why? Like, what? Why? Why do I need to do this? One way you can address that is by giving you, like, better forms of transportation. But even then, like, there's, like, 15 had that. 15 had the car. But there were parts of 15 where it's like, okay, you have to drive on the road. Right? Why? Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to spend an extra, like 3 to 5 minutes getting somewhere? And that doesn't sound like a lot, right? But, like, I'm playing a video game. I want to have fun. I don't want to just sit here waiting for something to happen. My favorite example of this in 15 is there were sections in that game where you would go from, like, one part of the map to another, and it'd be like it'd basically be a cutscene. You couldn't control the car. The game was just going to drive the car for you. But in a normal game, that would be a cutscene. You would have, like, the dialogue that happens, and then you get to where you want to go. In this game, there would be, someone would say something, and be like a little quip, okay? And then, like, a minute later, something else would be said. And then another minute later, there'd be something else that's said. So, like, it drags out the conversation for the entire car ride instead of spending the 30 seconds it would take just to have the conversation in one block and then just teleport you to where you need to go. I'm happy there is this trend towards more, not linear in a sense, but less open, right? A game that is more directed towards, you know, trying to send you along to where you need to go. I think, like, with recently I played Nier Automata. That was a really fun game that kind of came out in that time where a lot of open world games were being made. Like, that game did not need to be open world. There were so many parts of that game that were just traveling, especially like during those segments where teleporting didn't work, where they were just running across the map for the sake of running across the map. It's like, okay, well, you're in the main hub area. Go to the desert. Teleporting isn't working right now, so you gotta, like, run from the city area to the desert, and it's like, okay, there's nothing here to fight. Like, there's no danger. There's no reason why it should take this long. It's just taking a long time for the sake of it. And I get that there is some appeal to, like, building out the world and building out an atmosphere where it feels like you're alone. And I totally get that. But we don't need to make every single game about building out the atmosphere of an empty world. Like, that's what Nier was trying to do. It was trying to be like, you are these androids on Earth. There are no people here. There's just robots. It's supposed to feel lonely. But, like, there are some games that just don't need to feel lonely. And Final Fantasy is one of those games. Especially, like, especially with the fact that 15, you had the fucking boy band with you the entire time. It's just, I don't want to feel lonely when I have this party. Just let me go play the game. There's a whole set of other problems with 15 as well, but the open world certainly wasn't helping it in that regard.